All right, so now we're going to discuss the properties and reactions of carboxylic acids. So we're going to see, much like we were talking about how those alpha hydroxy acids are naturally occurring, we also see carboxylate salts, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is here in a second. They're found as preservatives in a whole host of foods. Okay, so basically carboxylic acids are everywhere. All right, so in terms of properties of carboxylic acids are to date going to be our strongest interacting functional groups because they have two sets of polar bonds. You both have this carbonyl group, which is polar. We learned about that when we talked about aldehydes and ketones. We have that hydroxy group, which is polar. We talked about that when we talked about alcohols. Both of those are found on our carboxylic acid groups, right? So both of these polar groups are in a carboxylic acid, including, right, we talked about how this OH group was particularly kind of important because it can undergo what's called hydrogen bonding. It can not only accept hydrogen bonds, but it can also donate hydrogen bonds. This partially positive hydrogen can form really, really strong bonds, intermolecular bonds. Okay, so because of that, because these carboxylic acids have these polar groups, they interact really strongly with one another, with their neighboring carboxylic acids. And so out of all the functional groups that we've studied to date, they actually have the highest boiling point compared to their other, similarly sized molecules that fall into the other categories. So for example, again, we talked about how aldehydes or ketones have this carbonyl group that's polar, and alcohols have this OH group, this hydroxy group that's polar. And again, a carboxylic acid has both, right? So it's got a higher boiling point than even an alcohol, which was higher than an aldehyde, right? Because again, we talked about how these OH groups form strong hydrogen bonds compared to when we were talking about our aldehydes and ketones. These have slightly weaker, what are called dipole interactions. Carboxylic acids can do both. They can both form strong hydrogen bonds and the slightly weaker dipole interactions. So that's what puts them kind of at this point the highest boiling point compound that we've seen, a functional group that we've seen. Okay, again, that OH group plays a big role in those strong intermolecular interactions because it can form those hydrogen bonds. It can donate those hydrogen bonds. We have a lot of functional groups that can accept hydrogen bonds. That's not as strong as when they can also donate hydrogen bonds. And because of kind of the shape of carboxylic acids, they can kind of form dimers. These are not something that like exist at all times. They exist temporarily or transiently, as we say, like for a few moments in time, a few microseconds at a time. But nonetheless, they're part of that really strong interaction between neighboring molecules. You see that the hydrogen on one can talk to the oxygen on the adjacent functional group, and then vice versa. Okay, so if we were going to take an alkane, an alcohol, and a carboxylic acid that are all about the same size, we can figure out which one corresponds, given these boiling points, which one corresponds to what. Again, the carboxylic acid is going to be the highest functional group that we've studied to date in terms of its boiling point. And remember that the alkanes were the lowest. They have really weak intermolecular interactions. Alcohols are fairly strong, but just not as great as the carboxylic acids. So these would be, in this case, in the middle at around 100 degrees Celsius. And when it comes to solubility of water, we have that same concept of hydrogen bonding. That's going to lead to small carboxylic acids being very soluble in water. And then that trend, of course, decreases as that carbon chain gets longer and longer. The back half the non-polar back half of that molecule gets larger and larger, the solubility will decrease. The approximate sort of cutoff that we use for carboxylic acids is if it's 1 to 5, it will be soluble. As we get more than that, it becomes sort of enters into that slightly soluble and then insoluble range. Okay, but again, it's all about being able to form those hydrogen bonds with water. You have this carbonyl group, which can act as a hydrogen bond acceptor, but just as importantly, we have an actual hydrogen that can donate hydrogen bonds. Okay. Carboxylic acids get their name because they are acids. They're weak acids, right? So let's remember what it means to be an acid. When you think acid, you should think proton donor. And by proton, I mean H+, right? We talked about 3A, the very first thing you would have learned was about how protons are found in the nucleus of every atom, et cetera, et cetera. In organic chemistry, when we're referring to protons, we're almost always referring to hydrogen ions, right? Because hydrogen ions just consist of one proton, no electrons. So that's sort of a shorthand. But yeah, so in terms of if we look at our ethanoic acid in this case, it can undergo acid-base reactions where, again, it's playing the role of an acid. It donates a proton. And it's this proton right here that will be donated. Oops. Okay, that's going to end up being given to whatever's playing the role of the base. In this reaction here, it's water. Remember, a base is just a proton acceptor, something that's accepting that donated proton. And so in this case, you're giving up an H+ ion to water. Notice that leaves, because if we looked at this OH bond here, you're giving up the hydrogen, but as a proton or as an ion, as a positively charged ion. So this pair of electrons is going to stay onto that oxygen. So at the end of the day, you'll have what's called a carboxylate ion, where that oxygen now has a negative charge. And it's given up a proton. Again, in this case, it's water playing the role as a base. Because it's given up a positively charged proton, you end up with a positive charge on that new molecule, which we call a hydronium ion. Okay, the most important reaction of carboxylic acids are this acid-base type reaction here, where it's giving up a proton and you're left with, again, this is called a carboxylate ion. So you start off with a carboxylic acid, can't spell, carboxylic acid, and you get a carboxylate ion. Okay, all the carboxylic acids tend to have around the same, what's called the acid dissociation constant, or this is related to the pKa. We're not going to, you sort of studied acids and bases in the previous semester. We're not going to go too much into that, but the bottom line is it's kind of a measure of acidity. And you can see that they all have about the same value. So the size of the carboxylic acid doesn't have much of an effect on its acidity. All those carboxylic acid groups are about the same. Big thing to take away from this chart, notice how if we're increasing in number of carbons, we're also increasing in boiling point. This is a trend that we've seen for every single functional group that we've undergone, or that we've studied. And then lastly, also we talked about that solubility. We say 5 and below would be soluble. As you get larger, you get into that slightly soluble range. And eventually, once it's large enough, it would be insoluble. Okay, so write the balanced chemical equation for the ionization of butanoic acid in water to form its carboxylate ions. Let me actually make some room here. Okay. Butanoic acid is 4 carbons, right? So I'm going to draw my 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. Put my carboxylic acid group on there. And importantly, it's going to be this hydrogen that's about to be donated, right? Acids are proton donors. So then I have water, H2O. And actually, I'll draw this out in its full structure so we can kind of see maybe a little bit of what's going on. So we have water, which looks like this. Now we're going to have the carboxylate ion that forms, right? Because that proton's going to be given up. And importantly, this pair of electrons is going to stay with that oxygen. So it goes from being a bond to being a negative charge on that oxygen, right? A lone pair. If I wanted to draw in all my lone pairs, maybe that might make a little bit more sense. This oxygen over here has 2 lone pairs and 2 bonds. This oxygen over here now has 3 lone pairs and only 1 bond. Okay, and then the hydronium ion that's formed, we can draw that structure out too to show that that water has now accepted that hydrogen and that positive charge. Okay, so this would be this balanced chemical equation for the acid-base reaction of a carboxylic acid with water. Okay. The other thing is if instead of having water playing the role of a base, we have like an actual strong base. So for example, sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide, then the thing that would be doing the proton accepting, let's just zoom in on this top one here, would be the actual hydroxide ion. And when that accepts a proton, right, so this is going to combine with this, and that's going to form a neutral molecule of water, right? Because I have the proton with the positive charge, the hydroxide ion with the negative charge. Together, those charges will cancel out, and I'll just get neutral water. I also have my carboxylate ion that's formed, and now it has this counter ion sodium. I actually don't like drawing these formulas like this because I think it's a little misleading. As it's kind of written here, it seems to suggest that the sodium ion is bound to that carboxylate ion. Well, if you're still in solution, which is how these reactions take place, this guy would not be bound to this molecule here. The sodium ion would be floating around all by itself, and the carboxylate ion would be floating around all by itself. Okay, they don't actually bind to one another if you're in solution. They'll both be dissolved in water floating around independently. If you then took that and evaporated off all the water, right, if I wanted to get rid of the water that after this reaction has occurred, then all of a sudden I would get this salt that would form. Then each sodium ion would find its carboxylate counter ion as I'm getting rid of the water. Okay, in solution though, I like to think about these as being separate. Notice that you could do the same thing with potassium hydroxide, sodium hydroxide, same sort of idea. You have your hydroxide and your proton coming together to form water. Now you just have a different counter ion. But again, I like to think about these as being separate. Okay. Now, what could happen is I could take, my formic acid as well as my solution of sodium hydroxide, mix them together, and then boil off all that water. And I would be left with a carboxylate salt, this thing here, okay, if I got rid of all that water. Carboxylate salts have their own properties. We talked about how at sort of the very beginning of the lecture, I teased that they're often used as preservatives in food. So we see them a lot and we encounter them a lot in our daily life. They're solids at room temperature. They have high melting points and they're also very soluble in water. So what that means is sort of exactly what I was cautioning before. If I have a carboxylate ion like this, and I put it in water, it's going to dissolve and dissociate into its 2 ion components. Okay, so that's why if you're still in solution, you want to think about these two as being separate. If you boil off that water, if you get rid of that water, then all of a sudden they'll find each other and stick together. And those are, again, high melting point solids that form carboxylate salts. Again, we see them sort of kind of all over the place. They're used as preservatives, meaning that they sort of inhibit the growth of mold or bacterial. They're also used just as flavoring components themselves. One of the sort of famous ones would be MSG, which is added to meats and fishes and vegetables and other sort of foods, and it has a very strong like umami flavor, a very savory kind of flavor associated with it. So that would be MSG, or monosodium glutamate. That's an example of a carboxylate salt. So again, another reaction. So we talked about the reactions of carboxylic acids and water. Now we want to make sure we can do carboxylic acids and bases. So here we're going to do propanoic acid. So 3 carbons with NaOH. Again, this hydrogen is going to combine with the hydroxide ion to form water. The carboxylate ion that's going to form is going to have 3 carbons. And again, importantly, that negative charge on that oxygen. And then we'll have our sodium counter ion. Okay, so this is the reaction of propanoic acid with NaOH. If I were to then get rid of the water, take that out, we could form that carboxylate salt. Okay, I just want you guys to, I'd want to stress, a salt doesn't exactly form in the solution. They're still dissolved into each independent ion. It's only when we remove the water that we would get the formation of that solid salt. Okay, more just carboxylic acids that we find in nature. They turn out to be a really important part of our biochemistry as well. First of all, if you talk about what's called an aqueous environment within a cell, most of our cells have a pH around 7. And your body does a lot to maintain that pH within a cell. And because of that, if you were to add any carboxylic acids to your cells, they would be in the form of the carboxylate salt. Okay, meaning that you don't actually have this form running around. This COOH is the shorthand for kind of this functional group here. If you were talking about carboxylic acids in solution or in your cells, they actually wouldn't be the carboxylic acid form. They would be the carboxylate form because of the pH of the cells. Nonetheless, these carboxylates are really, really important. They play big roles in metabolism. Okay, so for example, during glycolysis, which is the very start of what happens when your body is digesting sugar, the glucose molecule, so the sugar, is being broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which is the carboxylate salt version of pyruvic acid. So and actually, let's just go ahead and draw that carboxylate version. So this guy here plays a key role in metabolism. This this molecule is pyruvate. Again, it's the carboxylate salt version of the acid that was there before. Your body takes a molecule of sugar and breaks it into 2 of these carboxylate ions, and those are what continues throughout metabolism. If you're doing strenuous exercise, your pyruvate is converted into lactate, or the carboxylic acid or the carboxylate version of this carboxylic acid, lactic acid, right? So that's what builds up in your cells and makes your muscles really sore after a workout. Bottom line is both of these are carboxylic acids. They're key components throughout a bunch of our metabolic pathways. And another thing is, we know that we convert during digestion, our body will convert these sugars and then sort of exhale CO2, right? So where does that CO2 come from? It comes from an enzymatic oxidation of a carboxylic acid, right? So basically your body turns this sugar into citric acid further down the line than what we were talking about before. And then it will oxidize, catalytic or enzymatically oxidize this carboxylic acid group to CO2. And so that's the CO2 that you're exhaling is because of this metabolic step right here, where a carboxylic acid group is again enzymatically oxidized and releasing CO2.